It's good to have you both on. I feel like this is such a thing. I have to remember all the things we said on the prior podcast because we just recorded on your podcast,
Yeah.
and I have to avoid it. I'm just starting, by the way. I don't do any soft entries or anything. I just kind of record. So we'll probably include a good chunk of Maria fostering her camera and her light. So I need to remember, like, oh, if I mention something that people are like, what the hell is he talking about? It's because we just recorded a podcast for your podcast, which is called
Sacred Anarchies, a post-church podcast.
way cooler name than mine. And so I'll post a link to that in the show notes as well, and we'll probably plug it towards the end as well. But if people want, they can go back and watch that before this. We might be bouncing off a couple of ideas, but it'll probably be quite self-contained. Maria, Barry, you guys are in the UK with me. You are incredible minds. I mean, I've had the privilege of talking to you both over lockdown, met probably about March, April last year, and just been blown away with, just what you're doing, how you go about what you do. The way you guys think is just amazing. I'm excited for this conversation. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while as well. This is going to be really fun. Do you want to give a rough overview of maybe each of you, kind of who you are and what you're doing? I know you guys are probably very overlapped in what you're doing. And we can go a bit more into some of your story, some of your aspects as we go or something, but just kind of rough overview and then we'll dive off from there. I don't know who wants to go first.
Go ahead, Marie.
Barry and I have been best friends and colleagues for several years, and we have done work in the area of post-Christianity and post-theism and church innovation and theological innovation, as long as we've known each other in a lot of different capacities, some official, some unofficial. For the last, 3 or 4 years, we've been working on a very specific project together. And that project ended last December, and we launched H&CO, which is, what we're doing now. And, the podcast that we do is on behalf of H&CO. And, we're basically all about doing work at the intersections of faith and culture and theology and, helping people navigate those next steps after they find themselves outside of, parameters of traditional Christianity, traditional theism, traditional ideas of church, but they're not atheists, they're not agnostic. They want to continue to engage faith, but in ways that are really meaningful and transformative, and that don't ask them to compromise their sense of integrity or reason or postmodern sensibilities, but a faith that is actually living and breathing and dynamic and alive and centered in culture and context. So we do a lot of different things at H&Co. We do a lot of content creation, a lot of courses. We have culture courses every month. We have cohorts for churches, pastors, leaders, Christians who are finding themselves, what's happening right now? What am I doing as a person of faith in the 21st century? We have the podcast. We're launching a theological coaching model shortly. So and we do this all in the context of our friendship and, life that we've lived together, observations we've made, research we've done. So yeah, it's a big human project, I suppose.
Wow. Do you know what's funny about this? On your podcast, you introduced me as someone that does a lot and gets a lot done. And I'm like tired listening to that list. I'm like, God, I would just not know how to do it. I know it's two of you, but like, God, that's a lot of stuff you guys are doing. It's amazing.
Well, thanks for saying that, because it doesn't often feel like we're doing enough, but that's probably, my perfectionist tendency saying that.
You have to keep yourself busy.
Yeah, I know that feeling. I know that feeling of feeling you don't do enough, and then you count up the hours and you're like, a decent amount actually.
Yeah. Now your turn to have a go.
Oh, what she said.
Well, one of the things that fascinates me about you both is you've got very different backgrounds. Like in a lot of ways, there's a kind of crossover point in the middle where you kind of meet up. But like Maria, you grew up in the church, and Barry, you kind of grew up outside the church. I started reading your book, Sex, God, and Rock and Roll, which I think is a brilliant name. I just love it. Switching drugs for God, I think. That sums up God perfectly, right? For the opiate for the masses or whatever, yeah. But yeah, I mean, Barry, do you want to talk a bit about that? About like, some of your path, because you both identify as post-theist right now, right? Is that fair to say? I don't want to jump in the gun by that, or
Sure.
not at
Yeah.
all. You can
sure.
jump your opinion. Yeah.
Or if identifying is something you want to do or not. I know we're all very wary to put any labels on anything.
Yeah, we're
right?
like, we have to label it. Okay, yeah.
Sure. But I mean, you didn't grow up a theist. You kind of transitioned into that on some level, or is that not fair to say? Did you grow up kind of theistic, but just not?
Well, I mean, I grew up when, religious education in British schools was largely around Christianity, and I was exposed to Christianity, but I sort of came of age in an era when religion was essentially, as it still is on many levels today in Britain, largely sidelined and regarded as a historical kind of artifact. I mean, Britain is not renowned for being a deeply religious culture, So I grew up in a religionless and a largely religionless environment experientially. I mean, I had some encounters with it, but I never regarded myself as a theist. And to be honest, my entry into Christianity wasn't based on a desire for theism in the first place. That eventually sort of came with the package, and I took that on board for a while. But it didn't take me, well, it took me a while. It seems like it took me a while, but it took me about a decade to sort of come to terms with the fact that theism wasn't really a driving factor for me. So I sort of had to then work out what the implications of all that was, which is how I sort of then wound up getting involved in kind of academics and theology and stuff like that, because I was interested in the implications of all of that. But essentially, I came into religion as a young adult, in my mid 20s, and so I didn't have a lot of the burden and baggage that someone who sort of grows up in the church may find themselves dealing with. So, so Maria's story is much more entrenched, which I think in some ways is quite a typical American story as well. I mean, America is and remains a deeply religious society, however you pass that out. I mean, it just, compared to Europe, it's like...
it's night and day, really.
Yeah, it's completely night and day. I mean, what is it, 3% or less in England have religious affiliation, and it's like 48 or 49% in America, something crazy like that. So, yeah, so my religious experience was largely an adult experience. I still, walked into same church that everybody else walks into, with all of its, commensurate stuff. But a lot of that stuff was not, I took things on that I later kind of cast off. And there's a lot of stuff that goes with the territory, regardless of your age. But it was much easier for me to shake those things off, I think, than somebody who kind of is almost, I don't want to say brainwashed, that seems too unfair, but deeply, deeply indoctrinated into an ideological construct that permeates your entire being for most of your life. Yeah. And then fucks you up when you're older. Oh, are we allowed to say that? Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, 100%, as much as you want. I'm Scottish. Are you kidding?
I didn't want you to have to put a rating on your podcast.
I don't think enough people watch it to check. It's so interesting. As you were saying it, it's like, because I reckon about 70% of my audience are probably about American, and as you're saying that, I'm like, gosh, it's such a foreign concept to grow up outside of religion, because even if with that kind of like 48% or whatever it might be today, that people go, well, yeah, I grew up in a Christian home, I'm very deeply entrenched, I affiliate with Christian, like, even if you don't, everywhere, your money, in God we trust, you go to, you stay at a home, there's a Bible in your chest of drawers. I mean, it's just, there's just God everywhere. It's just everywhere you go, you're part of your declaration independence, start with your different things you say in school. You know, you make your proclamations and you swear to the gods, and you know, it's just everything is so
Yeah.
entrenched in it.
I should also
grow up in that.
Yeah, I should also say that the bulk of my religious experience was in America. My involvement in the church took place in California. So that was because I lived in California for over 30 years. So California was the large part of my adult life, and it's where I started to do the work that I was doing, and started to explore all the things that I was thinking. And but you know, but I've also done a lot of traveling and been involved in various things around the world, and I've always been interested in kind of what's happening and what's going on in the event of Christianity as it plays out in our time. So yeah, but we kind of intersected. I think. I mean, I think it's fair to say that I was probably, by most people's standards, fully deconstructed by the time I met Maria.
To say the least.
To say the least. I mean, I was still. I remain interested in. I remain invested and interested in the conversations in and around and about Christianity. And I was involved actually technically in both academic theological education and sort of quasi localized religious community experiences until I moved back to England, but in a very, very philosophically deconstructed way. So in a kind of, you know, creating different kinds of experiential communities that incorporated religion, largely Christian, largely Christian religious perspective, you know, because I think for me, that's the larger context of the shaping of Western culture. I mean, I'm interested in other religious ideas and ideologies, but arguably the vapor trail of Christianity is what holds Western culture and informs Western culture, and continues to. I mean, you know, whether people believe in it or not, you know, it's an undeniable aspect of life in the Western world is the impact of, you know, Christian thought on how we've shaped and framed our society. So I'm very interested in the symbolism of Christianity as it manifests in very quite often hidden ways in the cultural landscape of the West.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that's such a huge topic as well, because you can look at something and go, oh, 3%, you know, profess Christian. It can't be a very Christian nation, as maybe a lot of people would throw that term around. Yeah. But I mean, it's Christendom, you know, through and through. You go to the UK and it's a Christian nation in a lot of ways, right?
I mean, you know, the Queen apparently is the defender of the faith.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, there was a ruckus.
Isn't she the head of the church?
Yeah, technically, yeah. She's the defender of the faith. I mean, there was a big ruckus because I think many years ago, Prince Charles said that when he became king, he wanted to be known as the defender of faiths, plural. People got really pissed off about that and said, well, that's just not right. You know, what's the matter with him, you know, with his organic gardens and his, you know, anti-modernist approach to architecture, you know, and his double-breasted suits. What's wrong with him, you know? So,
it shows how attached to Christendom we are, though. And I often find this is a fascinating component. We pull it out. We're like, so none of us are Christian in this context, and we're all like, oh, who cares? And then he goes, oh, I want to be a defender of faith. And you're like, whoa, don't touch my Christian tradition, though. I like that.
It comes back to, I think it comes back again to the idea, you know, Feuerbach said that all religion is social production and all religion is culture. So we may not embrace Christianity. We actually might, you know, as a society, many people might reject Christianity and its ideology and beliefs, but they still see it as part of the national fabric. And if you challenge that, you're challenging what it means to be British or American.
Yeah.
And you see this over and over. This is why these conversations are more complex than we allow sometimes, I think, because we make too simplistic demarcation between this and that, and we miss the nuance of how that goes on. I've been reading a really interesting book called The Resource of Christianity. It's by a French professor at the University of Paris, and his examination is on the impact of Christian thought on the West, not what they thought, but the impact of how Christian thinking, positively and negatively, has affected the West. And I think that's a conversation that seldom happens, and it seldom even happens within Christianity, and even the work that you do, the work of deconstruction. It's really a question of the impact of particular kinds of Christian thought and thinking on individual and collective lives, and that's a conversation that I think needs to be had in conjunction with other more subjective and personal conversations to really get to help us sort of understand, because sorry, I'm waffling on here. I should shut.
This is good. It's a good waffle.
No, keep going.
We live in such a hyper individualized society, and everything is very subjective and very experiential today. It's all about memes, and it's all about me, and it's all about what I'm going through and what I'm dealing with. And we have a very sort of loose relationship to the culture in which we find ourselves, but we are who we are because of the culture in which we find ourselves, and it shapes us more than we realize. It gives us a language, which our language is what gives us ourselves. Without language, we aren't people, in a sense. That's one of the philosophical arguments, that language is what gives us, we're speaking beings. I think it was Heidegger or Hegel, whoever, somebody, we're speaking beings, and speaking beings is what gives us a sense of self. Well, if you speak this language or that language, you actually are a different kind of self, which is why language is so incredibly important. Which is actually how I wound up sort of interested in religion, and it's how I kind of wound up interested in philosophy, and how I wound up interested in deconstruction, because that's about language, not your kind of deconstruction. I mean,
no, sure, the philosophy,
deconstruction, stuff like that. So those kind of that's kind of, I guess that's sort of the kind of world of thought that I inhabit in these conversations, is the larger cultural threads and themes that wend their way through, and I think they're the darker threads that give shape to stuff, but we pay less attention to in the conversations, because our conversations tend to be more immediate, the issue and the crisis at hand, not the stuff that actually led to the moment at hand. Jesus, Barry, it's a Monday morning. Shut up.
That's good. You've given me enough to think about for the week now. I have to cancel all my other podcasts just so I can mull all this over.
Sorry, I apologize.
I love it. No, I love it. Maria, how do you?
This is what she has to deal with.
Stuff like this, I'm like, gosh, I am just... Yeah, well, I just sit and I'm like, gosh, I could listen to this forever. And people like yourself, like Pete Rollins, like these philosophical thoughts leaders that kind of like sit there and mull the stuff over and then can break it down so easily and so wonderfully. Like, how do you hang out with Barry and not just go, oh, what am I doing with life? I don't know what to say, what to do. Like, this is just incredible stuff. But I wonder, like, how do you engage with these kind of topics? Are you someone that really dives into the kind of intellectual kind of like extrapolation of these kind of theories? Or have you kind of gone about this process in your journey in a different way? Like, what's it like to be you on this journey?
Yeah.
He's way smarter than me. Let me just say that up front. So I'll just put that out there. So
That's not true at all.
very well. The thing is, there's so many different metrics of intelligence, right? I mean,
sure.
at the end of the day, and so. Yeah,
no, Barry is
absolutely.
incredibly gifted in so many ways, not just intellectually or academically. There are a lot of smart people, who can read walking around out there, but he has a gift where he can kind of integrate and synthesize and give back to you in ways that are really accessible and that make sense.
Yeah.
And will just kind of cut right to the heart of meaning, really. And he doesn't have anything to lose. He doesn't care. Like, zero fucks given, usually.
Excellent.
If anyone is ever trying to filter him, it's me. Because I'm like, I get you. I'm right there with you. But if you could just say it like this,
I've got a few fucks to give,
help
though.
me out. So, I mean, when I first met Barry, I was immediately drawn to the fact that there was something he was saying that I wanted, that resonated with me, aside from the fact that he is just incredibly fabulous to look at. I mean, we're on Zoom now, but when the world is open and life is open, you'll see him on any given day with his, suits from RTH and his loud Paul Smith t-shirts and his colors and his, leopard skin shoes and his long, he's quite the sight to sort of.
I'm going to link to both your Instagrams, but people need to check out the extraordinary style on UK Bloke on Instagram, because that's
Yeah, he's
mad inspiration there.
Just so many interests, and he's an incredibly prolific reader. He's reading dozens of. My husband also is an incredibly prolific, and the both of them, these two men that are closest to me in my life, are reading like. Barry probably reads a bit more than Simon. Simon probably averages like, I don't know, several books a month. Barry is more than that, and it's tough stuff. So I always say I go to his flat, and it's the library of my dreams. I'm always borrowing books from him. But when we met, as our friendship grew and our relationship grew, I would call him and I would sit there with a legal pad and a pen and just ask questions and just, start writing. I was really when I met him, I was literally a month out of my divorce, my first marriage, the divorce from my first husband being finalized. And I was coming out of really a religious environment that was, something, like we all engage on a fairly regular basis when we're working with people who are deconstructing. I had been in seminary for a few years, so I was thinking new thoughts, and, my intuition, and kind of the current of what I was learning was kind of moving me through some new ideas and forcing me to kind of leave some stuff happily behind. And so when I met him and I'm learning and we're talking and he's investing in this with me, I just, at some point, shortly after that, I was just like, what is this? What do you call this? And that was the first time I heard the term post-theism, and I had never kind of understood that, okay, so you have traditional theism on one end of the spectrum, you have atheism, atheism outside of theism on the other, and you just have this really unhelpful, super boring conversation going back and forth all the time. And what we were doing in our early conversations were transcending that spectrum and sort of asking what's next and how do you continue to engage your faith that kind of leaves both theism and atheism, in your dust as really unhelpful, outmoded, past their sell-by date constructs. And that's sort of what we were doing. And then that moved me into radical theology. And I was already pursuing continental philosophy. I was already pursuing, hermeneutics and, subversive ways of understanding all of this stuff. But yeah, he keeps me on my toes. And aside from, we don't just sit around and kind of talk philosophy and theology. We
don't shatter my illusions. That's what I entirely imagine you guys just sit and have these incredible conversations and then occasionally put out like a course or a podcast. That's what I want to believe. Okay.
We do that. We do that. We watch a lot of television and old movie films, and we eat yummy food and, cook, and we travel. Barry and I we've traveled a fair amount together. We love doing it. In fact, last Christmas, my last international trip before I came to England in March for the lockdown, we spent 2 weeks in Moscow over Christmas. And
Wow.
that was really incredible because one of the many lives that Barry has lived, Phil, you might find this very funny. He used to be a correspondent for, wasn't TBN, what was it? It was Pat Robertson's gig.
Yeah.
Back in the 80s under the Soviet
Yes.
Union. Yeah. And he spoke
That is my
Russian.
favorite bit of information ever.
I wasn't a correspondent. I hosted.
Sorry, you tell your story.
I hosted a Russian language television show with a Russian news anchor on the meaning of life.
Wow.
And it was around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union and Yeltsin. And it was interviews with Russian musicians and poets, interjected with essentially testimonies from Westerners of sorts. And it was for Pat Robertson, but it was for their international arm, so it wasn't directly linked. But it was, this was in the last gasps of my more official evangelical days, and so it aired at Christmas on the main Russian television network, and got 39 million requests for Bible literature.
Wow. Well, Pat must have been pleased.
Well, which is actually when I sort of then checked out, because it got co-opted by that and became something else. But I planted a couple of churches in Russia, blah blah blah. Did all that shit back then. So
you must be amazing at two truths and a lie. Because, do you know what I mean? The stuff you can pull out. Oh, yeah, no, I did this Russian TV show. No one's going to believe that. Come on, get off here.
I mean, Phil, I know you talked about his book earlier. So his book is fabulous, and you just go through it because you just kind of want to keep reading these stories. But I will say, as someone very close to him, it is just a fraction, really, of his life. I mean, there's so many untold stories. So we need volume 2, volume 3. We need.
Yeah, I'm fabulous. Let's move on.
Well, one of the things, I'm really interested. Obviously, my area of research, my area of work is working with a community of people that have self-identified largely as deconstructing Christians.
Sure.
And that is, a fascinating world, because you ask 100 people, what does deconstruction mean? You'll get 100 different answers in this world, in this community, all revolving around sort of the same sort of themes. And so I remember when we first started to research this, I sat down with a research team here in the UK, and they were like, all right, cool. So you want to research a group of people that are deconstructing Christians? There's kind of a gap in research. There's de-churched, there's disaffiliated, but they're kind of somewhere in this weird quasi place. Sure. What's a deconstructing Christian then? And I just sat there and I was like, I've worked with these people for like about 8 years at this point, and I'm like, shit, I actually don't know how to define this. I really don't. And there was this moment where I was like, I really, really don't know what this group is. And what makes it an interesting group is it doesn't really overlap with other traditional uses of the word deconstruction. I have a theory that generally, I think it's probably come from a more generalized use of the word deconstruction, where people are just saying, this is like, my house falling apart, like tearing my house down, ripping out a few rooms and realizing, God, this is a mess. Like that to me feels more likely. But another common use of the word deconstruction, I even say common is probably really unfair. It's quite a niche, I would say, unless you're in a kind of philosophical world, is the philosophy of deconstruction that kind of was coined by Jacques Derrida. And he kind of explored this kind of like, and I'm not an expert in this at all, kind of the kind of post-structuralist kind of like questioning basically everything, right? I wonder, do you have thoughts on... I know you're not a big fan of the term deconstruction as used by this community. I'm not either. I definitely have. Yeah. I'm constantly in this torn place of going, I wish we'd come up with a different term, but you know what? You don't get to change the term. At a certain point, it runs away, right? And so, and maybe Jacques Derrida would be the first person to go, who cares, right? I don't know. But could you maybe like touch on some of that? Because I know people listening to this would be so interested, but I do not have the philosophical expertise to kind of distill maybe a lot of Derrida's kind of thought on deconstruction.
Are you asking me, or are you asking Maria, or asking
Oh no,
me?
that question is
Anyone here that wants to begin?
You're the Derridian here.
Well, firstly, let me say, I think there is a natural tendency by people who want to to hang a hat on something, to appropriate a cultural word, and I think the same thing happened with when in the 90s, when postmodernity was a word that was in vogue within Christianity. Everything suddenly became the postmodern church, blah, 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 blah. Then the next thing, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way. I'm just saying that there's a trajectory here, and this is why I don't think that the deconstruction conversation actually is happening in a vacuum. I think it's actually part of a long line of conversations that are similar, that have happened in Christianity since the 1980s, particularly. And the same thing happened with the emerging church, emergent theory and quantum. You know, if you go back and you listen to a lot of the early emerging church people, you know, or people associated that, Rob Bell or Doug Padgett, people like that, you know, they were all talking about, you know, emerging theory and quantum theory and stuff like that. And deconstruction, because of the re-embrace in the last 10 or 15 years of the intersections of continental philosophy and theology, I think deconstruction is one of those words that's been lying around that fits in some ways. Although I've said to you, I think the distinction is a little different, but it makes sense to me. And you know, and without being cynical, in a decade from now, there'll be another group that emerges, and they will have whatever that cultural, it might be consciousness movement, it'll be something, you know, there will be, because this is how we are as people. We pick up words and we reinterpret them and reappropriate them for our cause, and they lose some of their initial meaning and they gain a new meaning. The challenge is, of course, is that the essence of what deconstruction was in philosophy, I think could be really helpful to the deconstruction conversation, but it's not really a part of the deconstruction conversation for the most part. You know what I mean? Yeah. And it's complicated because, as you said, it largely comes from Derrida, who was one of the sort of architects of postmodern thinking and philosophy. He was part of a group of largely French philosophers who became disillusioned with ideology in the wake of the failure of the Marxists to join the students in the 1968 student uprising in Paris. You know, 1968 was this really weird year where lots of strange uprisings, you know, sort of the hippie culture in America, student riots in France and Czechoslovakia and East Germany, you know, the Cultural Revolution in full swing in China. You know what I mean? There's this like whole thing that's going on, and out of that disillusionment, a whole new sort of philosophical world was born, that was essentially challenging the ideologies that governed the sort of Western world as we'd known it. And Derrida, you know, is the sort of architect really of this theory of deconstruction. And the reason it's so difficult is because he redefined it 3 or 4 times in his life. So you were never quite sure, even if you read Derrida, depending on when you read whatever work, you'd get a different take on it. But ultimately, it was about language, which is why I think it has such importance for any conversation about reconfiguring or redefining or deconstructing faith, is because basically he was sort of arguing 2 things really. One, you know, he famously said, "There's no meaning outside the text." That's one of his big sort of catchphrases, you know, very much misinterpreted, like, you know, McLuhan's "the medium is the message." And basically he sort of said that language, and particularly ideas in language like truth or justice, they're unstable and they're impossible to determine, and they're incredibly complex. So to try and affix a singular fixed meaning on that is problematic. You have to keep sort of drilling down into that concept, into that language idea, till you get down to what's inside that idea, which I think is what's happening. In some ways, arguably, I think what's going on in deconstructing of faith is a similar thing. He also, one of his sort of earlier things was that it was a kind of a critique, if you like, of the Platonic idea of the relationship between essence and forms. And, you know, you got to, I think we have to remember that a lot of Christian thought has kind of Neoplatonic issues at its heart. So, you know, when people say, "Oh, we're not into philosophy, you know, we're into theology, you know, we're into scripture." Well, you know, yeah, there's that you can't do that. That's the first thing Derrida would tell you, that you can't do that. There is no such thing as, well, the Bible says, you know, open the book. What's it going to say to you? Absolutely nothing. You read and you interpret, and you interpret. And much of our interpretation is inherited. And much of that tradition is riddled with Platonic philosophical thought. And essentially, you know, basically, Plato was like, the essence of something takes precedence over the appearance of something. So this isn't the appearance of the body. That's not it. It's the essence of the body, the soul. You know. So if you want to sort of understand how this plays out, the obsession of evangelicalism with the primacy of the soul and the afterlife, you can drill that all the way back to the Greek philosophers, and Derrida would go, no, it's the appearance that's important. He's not denying essence, but he's reversing the stuff. So ultimately, deconstruction is about digging down. Jack Caputo sort of who was very helpful to me in understanding Derrida, because you know, I'm a Neanderthal when it comes to philosophy, you know, and I read philosophical texts like a 3-year-old who's learning their ABCs. You know, I try and sound out the words, and you know, and I have no idea what an apple is until I see a picture of it. You know what I mean? So I'm no expert in this, but Jack Caputo sort of talks about the in the end, it's about what's going on inside something. That's the important thing. So what's going on? So it's not the name of God that's important. It's what's going on inside the name of God. So what's going, and you could take this out in a very kind of unprofessional way and go, it's what's going on in the name of Christianity, under that umbrella, that you really need to investigate and explore and look at. So I think I said to you before, I think a lot of what is called deconstructing faith is more a coming to terms with it's coming to terms with the need to drill down a little bit more into stuff, and also to face the fact that we somehow thought we'd got the answers. And when we learned that they weren't the answers, we spiraled into whatever it is that we've spiraled into. So I don't know if that sort of makes any sense, but so the philosophical tradition of deconstruction goes in a very different direction, I think, for the most part. And again, like you said, we're talking about deconstructing faith like we talk about all these things, like it's some monolithic thing that everybody's doing the same. It's like even Christianity. We talk about Christianity like it's one thing, but it's an umbrella. It's an umbrella. I mean, in America, they have 23,000 denominations. They're all under that umbrella, and they all believe the same and entirely different from each other. And so the deconstructing of faith is also on a much more personal level. I mean, there are groups of people, they have similar issues and stuff like that. I mean, I'm actually interested to ask you, what do you think are the key questions that people who are deconstructing are asking? Like, is there a nexus?
There's definitely huge overlaps, like massive overlaps. I think, like, generally speaking, you can tie them to the culture. You can tie them to what culture is asking and what the world is asking, because they're turning around and going to the church. Well, will you marry this gay person? Will you, how can you? I think something that really interesting, and I think it's quite subtle how this is played out, but I think it's becoming more and more interesting as it does, is the world right now, certainly the Western world, is asking about punitive justice. And we're starting to research more and more restorative forms of justice, of penal kind of, judicial kind of models and things. And even in the UK, which is historically very punitive, is starting to roll out different restorative models, because we're figuring out things like, if we spend £1 on a restorative model of prison, we save £8. So, it's just like, well, that works. And then we go, oh, and the recidivism rate drops from 87% to 22% or things like that. And so I think what that does is the world grows up, the world evolves, and it becomes less punitive. And then it turns around and goes, hold on, your whole system is based on a God who's punitive. If we figured out punitive stuff doesn't work, how can you have a God that's doing this via a punitive method? Why can't your God be restorative? And so I think as the world starts to explore new ideas, oh, homosexuality is evil, and then they move on and go, maybe it's not evil, and then they go, oh, actually, this is good, interesting, oh, cool. That's a hard shift for anyone to make in general, any kind of like radical change in opinion on something. But what they do is they turn around to church and go, what about that? And I think it's people within the church going, shit, my answers aren't that good on these questions. My answers aren't good on why does God burn people for eternity in hell, when even Hitler at like the 18th zillionth year, you're kind of going, all right, God, you're being a bit vindictive here. You know what I mean? At some point it goes, oh, this feels a bit whatever. So I think there's common questions for sure.
Yeah, and this is why actually we do the work that we do at the coal face of theology and culture. Because undeniable, for me anyway, these conversations that have been going on, and they've been growing in momentum since the 1980s. I think these conversations, this deconstruction conversation, it's culturally informed and it's culturally shaped, but I don't see very much cultural conversation going on in these deconstructing faith conversations, other than a critique of or an anger at, well, how did this happen? Well, it happened because the relationship between religion and culture is more symbiotic and synchronistic than we probably like to admit. And the problem at the moment is we have a modern, many people essentially, I think, were immersed in a largely modern construction of Christianity. And that remains institutionally the same, a sort of bureaucratic model of religion that got started with the Reformation. And in the culture, and particularly because of the very thing that we're using today, the internet and digitality, There's another conversation that's bleeding in to things like religion and spirit. It's why you have these conversations like, you know, I'm spiritual but not religious. 20 years ago, nobody would have said that.
Right.
You probably wouldn't have found a person 20 years ago or thereabouts who would have ever said, I'm spiritual, not religious. That's a contemporary distinction based on a whole set of dynamics, I think, that are at play in the way things are going. And I think what a lot of people, and the work that we've been doing, and the work that I did in Los Angeles was a very long time, was helping people come to terms with the shifts within them, to see them for what they are on a number of levels. Because I think on one level there's a natural the Christian perspective of a fixed ideology is actually unnatural. It's an unnatural thing. The questioning, that's natural. But religion that's based on certainty and security and satisfaction can't afford to be open and porous. It has to be a fixed ideology. And so people are unmooring themselves from that and then trying to work out what to do, and then how that plays out in many ways for lots of different people. But I'm talking too much. I'm sorry.
No, it's really good. But yeah, I'm aware as well. I'm sure you've got lots of thoughts on this. Like, I mean, looking at that, you know, these very static models of what faith can look like, and there is this component of a conservative, traditional, conventional model of religion is at best rooted in now, if not somehow willingly wanting to go backwards. And so it's always going to be at war with anyone that moves in a different direction. We might say they've moved forwards, but that would be seen as a regression for someone else, or however that might look. Sorry, Barry, go on, jump in.
Oh no, before Maria talks, I was just going to say, it's not just conservative. The liberal church is equally as challenging. Because they both operate on the same continuum. One has more room for social imagination and awareness, which is why sometimes there's a lateral move. People move from conservative churches to more liberal churches because there's more room to breathe. But the structure and the ideology at the heart of it, you still have the same problems because you're dealing with the same theological notions. They just stretch out in a different way, I think. But anyway, I'm going to
I agree massively, because I think that's what we see again and again. I think if you have a question of, well, my gay son came out to me and I really struggle with that because of course God loves him and I love him and I don't want to reject him and I don't want to I don't want to experience this. So you start to Google, can a gay person go to church? And you go, oh gosh, there's a progressive church down my road. Okay, cool. And you've not really questioned beyond that question massively. Maybe once you get there, they might ask a few other questions beyond that. Maybe you'd be exposed to, gosh, actually, yeah, my faith has been quite racist as well, or sexist, or whatever. But you're not going to start really tearing apart certain theistic kind of questions that you might in other models. So I do think a lot of people make very horizontal shifts rather than vertical shifts. You know, horizontal growth rather than vertical growth might be a way that I would often put that. But I'm interested, as you guys look at this, I mean, Maria, what is your thought on how we help people through this? What are these kind of post-theistic, how do we, because this is something that I think you go back 40, 50 years ago, people didn't have a post-theistic option on the whole. I mean, gosh, even today, most people don't. Most of the deconstruction movement I see, people are still going, does this mean I'm going to be an atheist if I'm not a theist, right? If I don't believe in God, like, am I just an atheist? Because there's fear of that, especially in America, right? Atheist is like, you know, the worst thing you could be. Some people prefer to be a Satanist than an atheist. And so like there's this whole world beyond that within post-theism. Like, what is it that you are offering? Like, what is it that drew you into post-theism, and how do you begin to lay that out for people as a playground to explore, versus that theist-atheist kind of discussion?
Yeah, great question. It's funny to say post-theist because it sounds so cult-like. And it's not in like popular vocabulary, so it does sound like this. I get asked all the time, so is this something like you and Barry thought up, or is this like something? I'm like, nope, it's definitely
Right.
accepted thought, and has kind of risen to the theological forum and university. Anyway, yeah, it's why we kind of don't like to use that terminology so much, because the terminology isn't as helpful as like understanding kind of where you're at theologically. And so, if anything, most of the time I use kind of post-Christian, because we're post-traditional notions of Christianity and post-traditional notions of God, and kind of God as the big other, and God as being, and God as object, as opposed to event and experience, as Derrida or Jack Caputo would say. I think one of the biggest things for me is to sort of get people to start thinking along completely different lines. And those lines would be something, something along the lines of just acknowledging what it is we're engaging and what we're not. And I think, Barry made the comment about, the liberal progressive church can be just as entrenched as the conservative church. And I totally agree. We talk about this a lot. We actually did a podcast on it a few months ago, because they're still playing within the web of traditional theism. And so they have a God, they have a metaphysical being, they're operating within kind of a supernatural understanding of God. Their God is just different. Their God is a bit more justice oriented. Their God is more inclusive. Their God is more universal, more accepting, more loving, whatever you want to say. They're a little bit more hands off when it comes to things like afterlife, but, they're still inviting you into the same church building with the same kind of pulpit, with the same kind of religious garb the pastor might wear. There's still the same old centuries old liturgy, and they're still praying to a God in the sky. Even if a lot of them don't even believe in that God in the sky, they continue on in their tradition. And that's kind of our pushback against a lot of it, is like, okay, your story is more inclusive and you're bent more towards social activism and all these, which is really a good thing. But theologically, you're still fairly conservative. And I think, part of the work that I do and part of the work that we do is helping people understand the simple fact that God and scripture and Jesus and all of that is only as good as their interpretation. People seem to think that Christianity and God live on some universal playing field, and that it's just an absolute situation outside of time and space and history. But we're all located on some kind of historical axis. We're all products of our culture and our context and our social locations. And those are the places where our gods are also born. They're the places where our gods are reborn and deconstructed and sort of reconstructed. And kind of going back to the whole literature piece that Barry was talking, deconstruction of literature and the meaning belonging to the text. I've done a fairly significant amount of work within philosophical hermeneutics. And, I remember kind of in seminary moving out of my conservative Christianity and out of evangelicalism and out of a very one-dimensional way of reading scripture, which was the Jesus and me story. And what is God saying to me today out of this particular scripture? And one, realizing it wasn't about me. It was about, it was not a Jesus and me story. It was a Jesus and humanity story, first of all. And second of all, that there is meaning in the text, but it doesn't, it doesn't jump out at us. And it is found within the text, and the text needs to be respected. And so what I mean by that is, I remember reading people like Umberto Eco, who would make the distinction between the empirical meaning of the text and the implied, meaning of the text. And, if Christians do ever do any kind of study into the text, they tend to do socio-historical, study, and who were the original readers and what was the original author, and was this written by empirical Paul or Paul's disciple, and was this originally meant for Ephesus or some other church, because if it wasn't Ephesus, then we don't want to read it because it isn't authentic. And something like the implied empirical distinction within literary theory, within hermeneutics, when it's applied, it says actually the text is telling the story and we don't need anything outside of the text. So it doesn't matter who empirically wrote it, doesn't matter who empirically its listeners were. The text will tell us both implied author and implied audience. It will tell us both the perfect author and the perfect audience, and we'll construct all of that. And in that process, it will construct its meaning and interpretation. And so there may be some sense of objectivity in the text, but it's only through our own subjectivity that we can kind of pick away at it. And it is a never-ending process. It is a never-ending spiral into the future, similar to, John Austin's speech act theory from the 60s. This was really revolutionary. And he was actually an atheist, but it's been applied to biblical hermeneutics for a couple decades now. And speech act theory basically says all communication has three parts to it. And, it kind of takes you through decoding that, what is the force in which something's being said, and what is like the intended response when that thing is being said. And so just kind of applying some of these general hermeneutical principles to the text was amazing and gave us better interpretations, more stored interpretations, more human interpretations. But then you take those kinds of principles and you start applying them to life. And you get, okay, there may be objectivity out there. There may be certainty out there. There may even be being out there. But it is only through my own humanity and my own subjectivity that I can start to pluck away at what there might be and what meaning it has for me and my community, while also understanding my historical locatedness, in all of this. And that is a very long explanation for simply urging people to walk with some sense of spiritual and theological humility, in loosening our grip on things that we love to control, loosening our grip on what we think we know, and just simply stating the reality that there's lots of stuff that we don't know. And there are lots of pieces to the puzzle that we don't have. And so I think that's where religion takes such a deadly turn sometimes, and any form of Christianity takes such, a fatal turn, is when we say, this is exactly how it is. These are all the things that we know. There's not much more to know. And if there are things to know outside of this, it's peripheral, because we've got all the important stuff for you right here.
Right.
And I think, what people are raging against in the current popular discussion of deconstruction, I don't think is God, if there is God. When Barry and I use the word God, the noun God, we tend to mean it in a very Jack Caputo sort of way. God as impossible, as unknowable, as unnameable, as uncontainable, as the insistence of God, as opposed to an interventionist God. But it's not so much raging against God, but it's what society and what Christianity and what institution has constructed as God. That is what is kind of needing to sort of be pulled apart. But also knowing that if there is a journey towards reconstruction, that it's not a matter of like tearing one God down and putting another up. It's sort of tearing one down and decentralizing the whole damn thing and sort of keeping it there and living there and living your life in the knowledge of unknowing or unknowledge. I know that sounds really funky, but the more I learn, the more I study, and probably same for Barry, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he would agree with me here. The more we find that we don't know, the more that we know, literally, the more that we download into our brain, the more we realize that actually we don't know much at all. And that is, I think, a really great place to be. It's a very freeing place, very liberating place, when you don't have to pinpoint and have it all figured out.
That's really, really good and really interesting. And I'm intrigued by this. What was that, sir?
I told you she was smarter than me.
Yeah, well, exactly. Why did you waffle on for so long, Barry?
Sorry.
I am so intrigued by this concept of uncertainty. So when we created a marker, we had to define deconstructing Christians for our research. So we created the three markers that we had, which were: they question their faith tradition, it doesn't manage to answer it successfully, so they change core values of theirs. And then the third marker I put in, which I felt was really important, caused a lot of controversy. We actually saw huge correlation. I think it was like 93% correlation with people that identify as deconstructing and this being a marker. So I think I was backed up, but it's a lot of controversy around it. And it was that people walk away with less certainty as they go on than they started with around their spirituality and faith. And I would argue across the board, because I don't think this is just a spirituality thing. I think it's a much broader thing happening to people, that this is how it affects their spirituality. So I just think that's a really interesting thing. But I think the reason it's so controversial is it's a really hard pill to swallow early on. I think as we're coming out of these worlds where we did have a lot of certainty, and certainty does. I mean, I'll tell you what, sometimes I look back and I think, oh, well, sure, nice. It was nice to have all that certainty and safety and security and know the way it was going to work and know what was going to happen tomorrow and know if I prayed this, this would happen. And if I just avoided that, that would happen. And that was quite a nice way to live in some ways. I also look back and go, what a prison I put myself in. And it also wasn't a nice way to live in many ways as well. So I'm not saying it's as simple as that. But I do think coming out of that and being hit in the face with this wave of uncertainty, right? You start to look at things and go, well, look at the text and look at it like in this way and start to explore it. You go, well, what do you mean look at the text that way? I'm getting all my answers from this thing. It's a very terrifying process to go through. How do you both kind of navigate this? Because you're working with people here. It's not just you're putting out a book or something like that people read and engage with just on an intellectual level. This is people that I know you've worked with, church pastors and different Christians and obviously people that are transitioning from that Christianity into more post-Christian thought. Even as people that are in post-Christianity, a lot of them are looking for some certainty. Yeah. I think that's why we have so many different models of what it can. Even an athist often is looking for a certainty there, and they find quite a bit of safety in that certainty. I've decided, no, there definitely isn't. Not all atheists, of course, but that can be the case. How do you navigate helping people transition into uncertainty and finding a peace? Because I have found long term, you develop a lot of peace about being uncertain and actually excitement. And the one thing you could maybe be certain is, well, I'm probably going to get more uncertain and it's going to be good and it's going to be fun and it's going to be great. What does that look like?
Do you want to go with that? Or
either way, it's if you have some, I can tell you whatever you want.
You go and then I'll follow you.
There's a lot of things that we're kind of coming up against in the certainty/uncertainty conversation. And one of the things is people dealing with trauma from the original certainty that they had. I do outside of H&CO, Barry and I both have Patreon pages. And one of the things on my Patreon I offer is one-to-one monthly calls. And in one of my one-to-ones, I had this woman who was just deeply struggling with her Christianity. And she has for a long time. And she just wanted me she didn't want me to help her find a new way of engaging Christianity. She literally came to me and was like, I want to be an atheist. I am done with Jesus. I'm done with God. I'm done with church. And not only am I done, like, I don't even like it. I don't even like Jesus. I don't even like the Bible. Like, I really just want to be an atheist. And so I'm like, well, why are you okay? Be an atheist. Like, what do you need from me? Because it sounds like you shouldn't be a Christian if you don't like any of those things. That makes a lot of sense. But she was like, I just really need to know that hell's not real. I just really need to know that the hell I'm pretty sure I stopped believing isn't real because I cannot chance going there.
Right.
And I mean,
it's a good one to hedge your bets on if there's anything, right?
Yeah. Like, and I totally get that. And it just like really breaks my heart because I talk a lot. One of the main things I talk about in my own personal content creation is afterlife, because it's one of those things that just haunt people like nothing else. And people just it's like the last thing that they can't kick. It's that last monkey on their back that they just can't get rid of. And so I spend a lot of time sort of talking through biblical ideas of afterlife and hell and helping people see like, hey, these afterlife concepts are always born in context and culture and social locations. It looks really different all throughout scripture, and it's nobody's best guess. We don't have one. And so really don't worry about it. Because at the end of the day, if you're living a life that is deeply human and you're living life well, don't worry. Like, if there's something else, then you're good. If there's not, then you had a beautiful, that sort of thing. But all that to say, it's the certainty that they had before they get to us that is really wrapped around their neck. That is so difficult to shake. So they want to move towards the uncertainty. They actually don't have any problem with it. This woman had no problem, moving out of it. But it was like, I just need to know that this isn't certain. And that's a different conversation. That's really hard. So, from one aspect, and Barry and I talk about this a lot, like we can take people only so far theologically. And we're happy to do it, and we're equipped to do it, and we can do it, and we have done it. And we will continue to do it. But there is something to be said that if you are dealing with that kind of psychosis and psychological trauma, that there really does need to be an invitation into proper therapy and to professional help, because your psyche needs to be addressed, your heart needs to be addressed, and those experiences that left you broken need to be addressed. And I've been having this conversation with some friends who are therapists, and Barry and I have had it, in the popular deconstruction conversation at the moment, there is a lot of trauma, and there is a lot of trauma that is being unpacked and being talked about. And I think it's good, because for the first time, maybe ever, people are having really safe spaces to unpack some of it. But I also do worry and wonder, I don't see people often, at least publicly, encouraging people to get themselves into therapy and to really address these things on a psychological basis. There's a whole area of psychology that's being opened up right now called, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, Phil, religious trauma syndrome. And all of these therapists are starting to pop up. And I think that's, a good thing. So I don't know. I think I just waffled there, but those are just kind of some of what I've experienced in those certainty versus uncertainty conversations. Barry, what do you think?
Great.
God, there's so many things to say.
I know, isn't there?
Well,
it's like one piece of it. That's my one thing.
I do want to address the uncertainty thing, and I want to address the idea. When you said looking back, there's a certain, wow, it's kind of cool when I was certain about things, and there is that lie. It's such a deeply theological. That's the challenge that the children of Israel faced in the wilderness. Oh, wish we could go back to Egypt, because at least we had bread. They forgot about the brick making. Amazingly, they forgot the trauma in their nostalgia. Freud said that nostalgia was the impossible emotion, because nostalgia is technically desire and longing for a particular space and time, and it's impossible to go back in space and time. As human beings, we can return geographically, which is the real root of nostalgia, but we can't return to a different time. And there's a very painful nostalgia attached to that, but it's also linked to the way in which looking back is always freighted with an overemphasis of the wrong things. So that's one thing that I think we try and sort of deal with quite a little bit. Just really quickly, the other thing is, again, this conversation about uncertainty isn't just a theological conversation. It's a cultural conversation. The whole world is uncertain about everything. I mean, the pandemic has thrown the whole world into a realm of uncertainty about how we've been living for the last decade. And there are so many people trying to answer it, and they're going, the environmentalists are going, well, this is Mother Earth getting us back. And the conservatives are going, this is the price that we're paying for, accepting homosexuality. And the economists are going, this is what happens when you allow, unbridled, free market capitalism. Everybody's trying to put meaning on a particular level of uncertainty. But interestingly, Jacques Derrida, to bring him back into the equation, in an essay, said that this is my paraphrase. He said, our reliance upon and our ignorance of the technologies that we use opens up a space for the rise and the return of magic, animism, and mystery. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, mystery in its broadest sense is, you could argue that in the theological world, mystery is the known unknown. So the extension of the mystical path is that you unite with the divine, but you can't name it. You know what I'm saying? But the other side of mystery is it's the unknown and the uncertain. And I think that there's actually a direct correlation between digital technology and the increase of uncertainty, because the wealth of access of information tells us that our understanding of the world is microcosmic. we only know what we thought was the whole story. It's, as you said, this conversation 20 years ago, you couldn't have this conversation because it wasn't globalized in the way that it is now. You have to write somebody a letter or have a phone call, but you couldn't have like a daily conversation around the world with people processing stuff. So, and I think that's an important part of the equation, to let people know that their uncertainty has broader ramifications than just religion. But on the religious front, I think what we try and do is two things. One is, there's a quote in the book of Ezekiel, where in one of his many encounters with God, the prophet is taken to this field of bones, and he's asked a question: "Son of man, can these bones live?" And I think that for us, part of our work is to say, what can be done with the bones of Christianity? Mm-hmm. What does a living skeletal version of Christianity in the 21st century, what might that look like? That's the broader question, where we can engage the philosophical, the theological, the communal, the social, and all of those kind of things, and have a broad discussion about how and in what ways you can actually rethink forward. Because the answer is these bones can live, but an army of bones is not the same as an army of flesh. So whatever this army is going forward, it looks different, and it should look different. I think that religion should always look different because it's always contextual. Mm-hmm. So it's not a rejection of the past. It's that you embrace your time, and your time gives a different shape to things. And coming to terms with that is the second thing. And there's this line that I've lived with from a long, long time from a novel, a desperate novel that Leonard Cohen wrote in a frantic phase of weird kind of experimentation, and it's called Beautiful Losers is the book. A mad book. But there's a line in there that I think is one of the most profound and moving and significant questions to ask in this whole conversation. And the line is this: how can I begin anything new with all of yesterday still in me? And I think this is what people are facing. The kind of trauma aspect, the yesterday that lurks inside of us, the burden that we carry, the weight that we haven't been able to offload. It can be overwhelming. And the question is, how do I move on when I've got all of yesterday stuck inside me? And I think this is where the conversations then become more personal. And I agree with Maria. I think that there are levels, depending on what you've been exposed to and what you're wrestling with, where you have to resort, where the answers can't simply just be another conceptual thing. You have to because you have to face your ghosts, and you can't dispel your ghosts. This is another Derridian thing. He called it hauntology. We are haunted people. We have a house full of ghosts. And the deal is, you have to learn not to be afraid of your ghosts. You can't get rid of them. They hide. And when they come out, they don't have to control you, but you have to, you have to turn and face your ghosts and know what they are. And that's I think how you begin something new, by realizing that there is no dispelling of our history. It's part of our lives, and for good or ill, it's there, and it can be a psychic scar for some people, but it can be lived with, not cured. as Leonard Cohen also said, there ain't no cure for love, and it marks you, and there is no cure for growing up in. I don't think a cure is the wrong word, but there is no complete resolve or resolution, but there is a future, and there is hope. But it's a hope freighted by the acceptance of doubt as a component of human existence and of religion. How we've actually managed to foster doubt, fob doubt off on the devil in charismatic churches, or a lack of faith in Pentecostal churches, or whatever. There's always been room for doubt, but it's how you deal with it. So Dostoevsky, my hallelujah is not the hallelujah of a child, but was born in the crucible of doubt. So doubt is actually an integral part of what it means to be human. We doubt everything, and allowing ourselves. So the future, I think, is wrapped up in a willingness to embrace and to continue to embrace doubt, to live with uncertainty, to understand the complex and contradictory nature of both the world that we live in and us in the world. We are contradictory human beings. All of us are walking paradoxes. We hold completely separate beliefs in tension without any problem, except when we see it in somebody else. But we're all walking paradoxes and complex. So our work is really about that. It's about can these bones live? The kind of larger questions about, well, what does it look like in what's the clattering sound of bones, the bones of religion in the 21st century, and then how do we begin the new when yesterday still lives? Which I think is a big philosophical and a big theological question that is answered. And then the third thing I would say, and this I would say to anybody who is trying to deconstruct anything, is I think the biggest thing that we have to overcome in the Western world is 2,000 years of the idea of a unitary cosmos, that there is actually a worldview that encompasses everything and gives us a picture. I gave up two things very early on in my own, if you want to use your terminology, deconstructive process. One was a belief in the inner life, and the other was a belief in a comprehensive worldview. And I found liberation in both those things, because, and again, in this, if there's anything that we can learn from the world of the internet, is there are a billion interpretations of the nature of reality, and we hold just one of them, and none of them are comprehensive. And this idea that you can sort of draw, Dante, the great hero of verticality, God all the way down to the depths of hell. We don't live in that world. We live in the world of cyberspace. We live in the collapsed world where things bleed, and we live in the world of Frank Gehry architecture, where the first floor becomes the third floor, but you can leave on the ground floor, and yet it all, the form is still architectural. And I think this idea that we can work it all out with God by all of life, that we have to come to terms with too. And I think it's an unhelpful thing to think that you're going to get all your life sorted out just by having, and I say the same of philosophy, because philosophy works the same way, you follow Aristotle or Plato or whatever, they're all like, this is how it all works, the spheres, it's all musical, and everything is all held together by form and by essence. And, that's why this, and you have all these hierarchies and stuff. And, Christianity is no different. God's got a plan for you. You know, God's in control. You know, well, yeah, if God's in control, it's a really chaotic form of control, isn't it? You know, because you've got, you know, it would have been so much better if you take like the story in the book of Acts of the Ascension, if instead of Jesus gave that vague, like, go to Jerusalem and be my witnesses, he'd have just said, oh, by the way, here's a handbook before I go. This is how it all works, people.
Right.
So, you know, women should shut up forever, always, because, you know, they got nothing to say. I want elders and deacons, you know, and blah, 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 blah. It didn't come with that. You know, people keep going, oh, the Bible's a guidebook, it's a handbook. You know, now it's, you know, God is a hard drive, or, you know, God is a cloud. You know, I mean, we always use the language of our time to say this is a comprehensive understanding of the nature of reality. No.
It's terrible, right?
It's reaching in the darkness for a glimpse of light. But you don't need the light shined on everything. We can't work it out anyway. It turns us into, I don't know. That was a big waffle.
Well, and if I can just add a little bit to that, you know, I think we do a lot with theological realities and not empirical realities, because empirical realities, they're just impossible, and it's kind of a fool's errand. And why would we? You know, it's why we've kind of stopped you know, moving around in circles of metaphysicality and supernaturalism and object and being, because it's impossible. And so what are the theological realities at play here, and how are they transformative, and how are they powerful and subversive and still speaking? And so that's why, like, people get confused with us, because we talk about being post-Christian, we talk about being post-church and post-theist, but Barry and I teach out of scripture all the time. Barry's a fabulous Bible teacher. I've done a lot of study within scripture. I love teaching out of the Bible. And it's why we do it, because we are reckoning with theological realities, and we are reckoning with how those theological realities speak to the particulars of context in everyday life, not empirical realities that are making universal stances and judgments on things for all of space and time forever and ever. And there is a freedom in that. When people want to debate me all the time, and I'm not interested. I'm not interested in debating you on resurrection or things about virgin birth or anything literal and historical that you want to hang your hat on. I don't give a fuck. I don't care. Like, whether it happened or not, it doesn't matter. What I'm after is the theological reality and what it's saying to us about humanity, God's relationship with humanity, and, you know, what it all means. I mean, I always tell people religion is all it is humanity's mechanism, or a mechanism for meaning making, right? That's what it is. And so, you know, when Christianity isn't working for someone and they go, okay, well, I'm going to become a Buddhist, or I'm going to become a Muslim or a Jew or whatever it is, you know, it's essentially exchanging one horizon of meaning making for another. And sometimes if people find it to be very helpful, okay, great, you found your place in the world, that's fine. But most of the time people are just searching. It's like religion hopping or church hopping or denomination hopping or whatever. And there are crazy high stats on this kind of stuff. The amount of times people will switch those things in their lifetime if they are religious or Christian. But this isn't about being an evangelist. It's not about proselytizing. It's just saying, like, you have a story, like Barry said, you can't cover over that. You can't negate it. You can't change it. You can build a future on it. So work out your story in your story. It's why we still live and breathe within the innovation of Christianity in the West, because it's our story and we're working it out into the future. And I think that is what we want to lead people in. And that is what our work is all about.
It's really beautiful. It's just, yeah, it's a beautiful way to approach it.
We're in the business of making meaninglessness.
Yeah, I love it. It's very meaningful. No, I think it's such a fascinating concept. You know, I think we do this, you know, going back to your nostalgia point, like, we look throughout history and we find, oh yeah, they did exactly what I'm doing now the whole way through. And we forget that Christianity has evolved. Christianity develops and changes radically along the path, you know, and even in Judaism, that evolves. I mean, you just open your Bible and you've got Jeremiah going, I know Moses said that God said sacrifice stuff, but I don't think God said sacrifice. And you're like, if we've got this like linear, like very flat concept of that's not evolving, some of this stuff just immediately creates problems, which is why you just put
Yeah.
just in the words and it's fine. Um, but like, I think seeing this as an unfolding process, seeing this as an evolution, seeing this as a process of development, of growth, it might be very nonsensical to a lot of people coming from where they are to see a movement away from certainty as a growth. I think that's very hard for a lot of people to grasp. But I think I can't remember if it was on this or on the other podcast we talked about James Fowler briefly. But when we look at different developmental models of faith, we used one in our research, a revised faith development scale. Almost all of them measure across all faith types, including actually coming out into non-faith types like atheism stuff. What they measure in maturity is a decrease in certainty. Almost across the board, unilaterally, they go, yeah, when people mature and grow up in the way they create meaning in their world and they see the world and they center their ego, it's with less and less and less certainty. And so I think it's really exciting what you're doing and really and fascinating. I'm sort of person that I could listen to you both forever. I just think, you're just incredible minds and Maria, what you're saying about Barry, I think Barry would probably say the same to you. I certainly think the same, that you're thinking and looking at things that are really complex topics, really hard to do. And the vast majority of people that are going through deconstruction don't have time to look at them at that level. They need them kind of broken down and fed to them a bit easier because, we have the privilege, we're very fortunate to be able to do what we do for the most part full time. We're able to go, I'll sit and think about this for a day and I'll actually delay doing even a podcast this week. I've got the freedom to do that if I need or whatever. The vast majority of people are working a job, they've got families, they've got kids, they've got like 110 things they're juggling, and they don't have time to sit and think about these philosophical concepts. They don't even have time to sit and think, what's happening to me right now? Even that question can take years to unpack when someone else might be able to unpack it in a month if they're privileged enough, and so I really, really appreciate what you're doing, because the ability to look at things on these higher levels of complex, intellectual thought and the cutting edge of thought as well. These, we're talking about very, very recent ideas. And generally speaking, it takes an idea a while to be around before it's very understandable. And so you are doing that work. You are bringing some of these very recent and new concepts, maybe older than we think, but new concepts and making them very accessible. And I love that. Can you tell me a bit about what you're doing right now? Because we were talking this week, but you are actually about to do a 4-week course on deconstruction, on using the language of Can These Bones Live? Can you talk a bit about that? Because I know that a lot of people listening into this are going to be miffed big time that they only got like an hour and a half with you guys. And they should check out the podcast that we did as well. We talked a bit more on your podcast, and I'm sure there's lots of stuff on your podcast they can dive into and explore. But certainly from the perspective of, as a deconstructing Christian, someone that's, or in that verbiage at least, someone that's going through that process of evolving and changing radically in their faith, people that are connected to what you're saying, I'm sure would love to sit through a 4-week course of you guys kind of breaking this out. Can you talk a bit about what that is and what people might be able to expect from it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll both speak to it. I'll speak to the logistics about the culture courses, and maybe Barry, if you want to talk a little bit about the content. Essentially, we do culture courses. We usually do them every month. This one we're starting mid-month, so March 11th. But it's essentially looking at really pressing topics. Don't know where that word came from. Topics that come up. There we go. Topics come up that are coming up in culture, in pop culture, and Christianity. And looking at sort of, okay, what's happening at the intersections here, and making, like you said, this stuff a little bit more accessible for people who aren't in seminary, who aren't at university, who don't have time to read all the books and be in all the conversations. So our culture courses go for 4 weeks. They last for an hour and a half every week. We do live Zoom meetings. Lots of people can't make it live, so we have a learning platform in which you can access the lecture, the recorded lecture, and watch along and be a part of it there. We have dialogue on our learning platform. There's no homework, there's no required reading. It's literally, come and engage and soak up a good lecture, good content, and engage with people who are in the class and the instructors as well. We have a variety of people who work with us on these culture courses. And then sometimes it's just us, or sometimes it's just one of us. This culture course on deconstruction happening in a couple of weeks is being taught by Barry and myself. But yeah, essentially, we're trying to get to the heart of what the deconstruction conversation is all about. And we're exploring it through 4 different topics. We're going to be talking about doubt. We're going to be talking about the trouble with church. We're going to be talking about Jesus. And we're going to be talking about, the possibility of faith after religion and giving people really a hope for the future. But Barry, maybe you want to talk a little bit more about the nitty-gritty of the content.
Well, I don't know. I think you just did a pretty good job, actually.
It's a pretty good overview.
Yeah, it's like, what should I say? No, I mean,
gotta be careful with this one, Barry, in case you break the just.
I know. Yeah, I don't want to break that. It's so concise and perfect. But essentially, we are sort of going to offer our take on both the macro and micro elements of the deconstruction of faith, alongside probably philosophical and theological practices of deconstruction, as well as a companion to a conversation. But essentially, we're sort of going to look at, as we've kind of said all the way along, this particular moment in time is characterized by certain dynamics within religion, and then within Christianity in particular. And the deconstruction conversation in its many forms is one of the it's a core conversation at the moment, and it comes on the heels, I think, as I said earlier, of a trajectory of developments in late modern Christianity that have brought us to this point, alongside the technological world that facilitates a new kind of discussion. So we're going to bring all those kind of threads together and talk about basically what those bones might look like, what they can, we don't offer models, because we think there's a very contextual dynamic to both personal and corporate, if you like, so our approach is not to go, and here's how you fix this, or 4 easy steps to building a deconstructed church. It's not that. Right. It's a different kind of theological conversation, but it's really around how you navigate and negotiate that, both on a personal level and maybe even on a communal level. So what does a community, what can a deconstructed community look like? Because it can. I mean, what shape does that take when you let go of all the things that you think you have to have? It's like, see, I told you I've already messed up Maria's concise thing.
No, that's good. Well, I know just that one point will grab certain people, because we talked, I think maybe it was in your podcast again, the grief that you go through, the loss that you go through, and loads of losing a relationship with God, losing a relationship with your family, losing your certainty, losing, so much stuff. But the number one, this is really interesting, but they studied this quite extensively of the different griefs lost as you transition out of religion. And across the board, again and again and again, the one that is the hardest on people is not the loss of even internal existential understanding of yourself. It's not your church. It's not God. It's the relationships themselves. Number one thing. And so community is what people, more often than not, the number one thing they're seeking. This is why I made the Deconstruction Network, is like, I'll try and help you connect. But that's a big question, and it becomes complex, because even in that, I remember when I first started the Deconstruction Network, I was like, all right, great. Go sign up and you meet each other and it'll be fine. I was very naive in a sense. And then you click LA and there's 40 people. And then I get a message. I'm like, wow, they're hooked up. That'd be great. I get a message from one of them going, I messaged every single person in LA and I just don't click with any of them because none of them want to get together to worship. And I'm like, well, I can see why, maybe, but I'm
Yeah.
like, I hadn't thought that you deconstruct but still want to sing to a god. And then other ones go, oh yeah, I don't want to do worship or anything, but I do want to kind of still get together and pray. Or and someone else going, well, I'd like to get together and meditate, or I'd like to get together and talk about philosophy. And you go, oh, this is going to be a bit like herding cats. So these
Yeah.
kind of concepts of like, can we build a community? What could that look like? These kind of things, huge questions. And I think because it's so new, we're still figuring these things out. We're still kind of flying by the seat of our pants, you know. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's huge that we look at these kind of topics and we explore these topics. And I really appreciate you guys doing that. And I'm very careful at what I plug. People will know this because I'm very protective of my audience, and we talked about this on your podcast as well. I have quite a strong opinion on maybe with the best of intentions how unethical some programs, some courses, some books can be in becoming too prescriptive and this is what it should look like for you.
Yeah.
And knowing you both, I remember Mireia said, "Oh, you can check this out and do this and this," and I'm like, I know you both. I know that's not where you're at. I know that's not your goal is not to be like build this particular outlook on life and do exactly this. So I personally just recommend people they check it out. We'll put a link in the show notes to that, and people can find it on your Instagram, your websites, and stuff like that as well. But yeah, this was so much fun. Honestly, I absolutely loved it, and maybe we should do it again. Definitely at some point we should have
when we have a
chat.
little more time, because this was a bit constrained.
Yeah, well, you know, I was a bit tight on time, but maybe we can come back for a good 3-hour waffle or something. You know? Maria, we'll leave you to another one so you can actually dive in a bit more and get a word in edgeways. You know.
So I'm used to it, so it's all good. It's all right.
I know. But yeah, no, I would love to dive into more of your story as well. And I mean, both your stories just are just so intriguing to me. And I'm always fascinated by how people unravel and how that starts, how it fleshes out and where people see themselves going. And it's just so exciting to see the various ways people can engage in this life. And
yeah,
it's
it is exciting. And, you know, we love the work that we do, and we love kind of hopefully the freedom and the liberation and like the new directions it's providing for people. Speaking of our stories, so we're doing a deconstruction series on our podcast right now, and you are going to be part 5 that will release tomorrow. Actually, it's Monday the 1st, so it'll release on Tuesday the 2nd. But the last 2 weeks of our podcast and these deconstruction conversations, Barry and I have shared our deconstruction stories. So he's part 3 and I'm part 4. So if anyone's interested in that.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna have to dive back and go through them as well. And for people that are used to my podcast, which goes on and on and on and on, this is a short podcast for me.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I'm usually an hour and a half to 3 hours, so I go on. And so, you know, people that are used to that, like your podcast is 20 minutes. It's amazing. It's just nice, bite sized. You can dive right in, get some real juice out of it, and be on with your day. And so I'm excited to go in and dive into those, because I don't have time for most of the podcasts I really like are like 3 hours long, and I'm like, where the hell am I getting 3 hours from?
I know, I have all of these podcasts in my downloads, and I'm like, oh god, I don't have time.
Never listen to any of them. I know it's the overwhelm. It's like the books, right? They stack up, and you're like, I'm going to read them all, and then you get through a handful. But no,
or at least the
this has
first
been
couple chapters
really
of a dozen books.
Yeah. Or if you're like you, right? You just marry someone that reads a lot. You work with someone that reads a lot, and you go, could you read everything and just kind of give me the cliff notes?
Give me the cliff notes, exactly.
That's amazing. It's the way to do it. I reckon. I need to get around more readers.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, well, or maybe not. Maybe that's it. I've got so much envy of all the readers I'm around that I'm like, I want to read as much as you. Tell people about how they can connect with you respectively and together. I know you've got H&CO together, but you have your own platforms and stuff that you're doing, your own Patreons. People can support what you're doing as well and connect with you more. Can you kind of give a little plug there? And I'll make sure there's links to those. And the show notes is just going to be links.
Yeah, you're going to have a lot of show
pages
notes.
And pages.
So you can find us at hncogroup.com. And if you go to the collaborators page, you'll see Barry and I, and that'll link to our websites. He is ukbloke.com. I'm mariafrancescafrench.com. We both have Patreons. You can find us on Patreon as well. Our website's linked to our Patreon. Our Instagram bios linked to our Patreon. And our Instagram on H&Co, we try and keep that updated. fairly often. We were doing daily for a while, but kind of fell behind a little bit. But we're always trying to give out bite-sized pieces of information, and not so much information, but I would say thought, theological thought, philosophical thought. We do a lot. This was a very theological podcast, but we do a lot with technology and digitality and virtuality. We do things with film and art every Monday, at least in England nighttime, for America daytime. We do Instagram lives called Monday Musings, and it's Barry and I musing for about 20 minutes on like any given topic. So we'll talk about food trends, we'll talk about trends in retail or the internet or film, or so we kind of break out of the realm of theology and philosophy a little bit there and just have fun. We have a little bit of a cult following on Monday nights. It's fun. So we do a lot of different things, but yeah, you can find us all over the web. I'm sure Phil will put it in there for you. And yes, we're inviting anybody and everybody into our new culture course on deconstruction. We'd love to have you if you've never done a culture course with us. And I can tell you absolutely unequivocally that it will be very solid content that you can trust, and that we'll be very excited and happy to and honored to sort of partner with you in your journey. So
yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm,
I really appreciate having you both on. Honestly, it's been a real privilege and a real joy, and certainly intellectually stimulating. I'm gonna have to like kind of process for the next few hours and then let it all sink in.
I need a little drink after this.
I know, right? That's after midday. It's perfect.
It is. It's pandemic.
Sunny outside,
Day drinking on a Monday. Yeah.
It's
pandemic, right?
Yeah, it's pandemic. It's our excuse for everything.
What are we going to excuse after pandemic, right?
Well, then it's post-pandemic celebration.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Post-pandemic,
absolutely.
living life.
I love it. Well, thank you very much, guys. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you taking the time. I know it's not the funnest thing to do on a sunny Monday day when you could be outside drinking. But I hope you guys have a good day. I'll let you know when this comes out. I think, so when does your course launch? It's the 11th, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Which is what day?
Friday?
Thursday. A week from Thursday.
Okay. So my podcasts usually come out Thursday, so I'll bring it out this week because next week would probably be a bit tight so that people have time to think about it, to check it out. And so, yeah, so it'll be out this Thursday. I'll let you know, and I'll share some links and stuff.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Thanks. This is great. And use the link I sent you, so it'll go back to your affiliate account.
Everyone, make sure you buy it through these guys. I get 10%. I don't know what it was.
20%.
Yeah, 20%.
Look, if you follow through on this, guys, I'll just retire. I'll disappear off the face of the planet. I was actually in it for the money. I'm out.
Yeah. Well, we're only in it for the book deal, so that's good.
That's it. Oh, and talking of books.
Oh.
Make sure you grab Sex, God, and Rock and Roll, Barry Taylor. I can vouch for the first third of it. It's fantastic. Maria vouches for the rest of it. And we're all looking forward to the sequel.
And Barry,
the fleshed out bits.
You need to send this man the sticker cover or the cover.
Oh, yes, yeah, because I don't.
Oh, you told me about that, yeah.
I don't like the title, so.
You don't like the title?
It's a bit.
Was your hand forced by a publisher?
Yes, it was. Yeah. He thinks it's kitschy. His original title was Sacred Anarchies, which is why we named our podcast that, because we're like, okay, let's let this live somewhere else. But yeah,
I love it. Awesome.
But I'll send me your address. I'll send you a sticker.
I bought it. That sounds great. I don't know how many copies of each are there. Like, which one's going to be worth the most long term? That's the key.
Well, there is no reason.
Are you pretty on it on sending out these stickers? Really getting it out there?
Yeah,
it's a mission.
Yeah, awesome. Well, have a great day, both of you. I really appreciate what you're doing, and we'll stay in touch for sure. But I'll let you know on Thursday when it comes out for sure.
Thanks,
perfect.
Man.
Thanks, Phil.
All right. Love you both. Bye.
Love you. Bye.
If you are deconstructing, there is no reason to do this alone. It can be an incredibly lonely process, but the deconstructionnetwork.com is a free resource to help you find others deconstructing in your local area. If you would like to support what I do, everything I do is for free, from talking to people for hours on end to producing resources and podcasts. It is only possible because people give generously. There's never any need to give. It will always be free, everything I do. But if you do, we do have an amazing private community group that we talk on over on Discord that you would gain access to. And we do regular audio and video chats on there as well. So it'd be great to see you in there. But of course, never any requirement. And of course, please, please, please come and talk to me on Instagram. I love connecting with people. I love helping people on their journey. If you need a safe space to process your deconstruction, I would love to connect. It's just at Phil Drysdale. Love every one of you. Peace.